You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. Welcome back to part 3 of the Encore series, Doing It Right, Successful Advancement of Law Enforcement Technology, to show how law enforcement is utilizing technological advancements throughout the country. Experts in the field of law enforcement join in the conversation to share their thoughts on current technologies, the true benefits of having various tools, and what it means to the communities they help protect. In parts 1 and 2 of this program revisit, the participants covered a variety of areas concerning law enforcement technologies and their implementation. Part 3 concludes this series by discussing how communities are affected by these decisions, the importance of community engagement and involvement, and ultimately what that meant moving forward in the process. And now for part 3 of Doing It Right, Successful Advancement of Law Enforcement Technology.
Great to hear, Chief. In Miami, I know, again, from what you said a moment ago and from talking to you previously, that you all really put a lot of time and effort into developing responsible use policy. Can you talk about that process a little bit more, and particularly how you engaged the community before you did that?
Absolutely. So we've heard, I think every panelist in one form or another mention the importance of trust and legitimacy, amongst the people that we serve. So that's what we in law enforcement would call a clue that's important. And really, you can't get past that initial hurdle if you're not there yet. In Miami, we have built that trust and legitimacy with the community that we serve. It's not perfect. It's never perfect, but it's come as a result of a lot of hard work, a lot of mistakes through the years that got us to where we are. But the community has to believe that they can trust what we're telling them and that we're acting in their best interest. So it's certainly, the time to try to start to build that trust is not when you're trying to implement something new. That foundation needs to have already been there. But again, going back to where I wanted to really tackle this issue head on, for me, it really started with a January 2020 article in the New York Times that wrote about Clearview AI and facial recognition technology in general, and it painted, I think, a rather dystopian picture of what that technology could be used for in the hands of law enforcement. So it obviously points out the pitfalls of false positives, of implementation processes that are absent any public scrutiny, the potential for weaponization, looking at things like scanning people who are going about their business in real time and identifying everybody as they walk down a public street, identifying people who are engaged in peaceful protests, officers using the technology to stalk a potential romantic partner. And really, the absolute worst thing about the article is that it was dead on right in every single one of those concerns. These are all very valid concerns that we looked at, and we said, you know what? Challenge accepted. We think that the pros can outweigh the cons if we are responsible with the technology and with the information that people consider to be private. So again, we started looking for model policies. We really found, again, because this is relatively new, we did find a dearth of policies that we could really refer to. So we said, you know what, let's look at op-ed pieces, let's look at news articles, but really we focused on those op-ed pieces that were critical of the technology. And again, we heard this also from Ganesha, right? Don't be afraid to step out of that comfort zone and read articles, talk to people that may not agree with where you are, right? We in law enforcement, we automatically think that what we're doing, what we're going to use the technology for is noble, right? But then there are other people that haven't had that experience with law enforcement and really, know of what what that darker side could be. So by looking at all of those op-ed pieces and news articles that were out there, we built a policy framework where we had a good idea of where we wanted to go and what we wanted to present to the public. So we wanted to make sure that we had a policy that safeguarded against officers and detectives treating matches as probable cause to make an arrest. We never wanted to be in the position where we're telling somebody, hey, you're under arrest because the algorithm says you did it. So we wanted to make sure that we were treating matches just like a tip that gets called into Crime Stoppers. That you get that match, you still have to go through those traditional investigative steps to put somebody in a photo lineup, to get fingerprint evidence, eyewitness testimony. All it is a tip or a lead. We then wanted to narrow the number of authorized users that we had. We felt that a system where everybody on the department who wanted to have this technology at their fingertips was going to be very difficult to control. We have 1,400 sworn officers and another 400 or so civilian employees. And so we felt that by narrowing it to about a dozen authorized users, all of them either our crime analysts or our detectives in our real-time crime center, we could really make sure that group of 12 were really well trained in the policy. Everybody else also got training, which I'll talk about in a moment. But that these were the people who were most well versed, and these are the gatekeepers. You have to go in writing to any one of these people via email whenever you want to have a face that's run through any one of our platforms that we utilize, and you have to provide a case number. You have to provide what the predicate is for that search. Is it a criminal investigation, an IA investigation? Are you trying to identify a deceased or disoriented person? So we wanted to make sure that paper trail existed. We also created an auditing process to make sure that a supervisor looks at those searches on a monthly basis and ensures that everybody is in fact using our face recognition platforms for authorized uses only. We also wanted to make sure that we weren't using this to identify people who are engaged in any constitutionally protected activity. So again, identifying peaceful protesters, identifying people who are members of a religious group or of any civic group. We wanted to make sure that it was strictly for the purposes that I mentioned earlier. So with that framework in place, we then decided that we were going to reach out to our stakeholders, and we decided that we'd start out simple and have some, start talking to people that wouldn't have a big problem with it. So we went to the ACLU. No, I'm kidding. So we decided, you know what, let's go big or go home. Let's talk to somebody who is absolutely not going to have, it's not going to be in favor of our use of this technology. And so that meeting with our local chapter of the ACLU, they were very clear from the outset. They were happy to be brought to the table, but just as their opening statement to us, they said, "There's really nothing that you're going to be able to tell us that is going to make us happy with your proposed policy, other than you're going to kill the program altogether. That would make us happy." And we said, "Well, that's fine, but we want to know why it is that you're uncomfortable with the technology." And so we took, all of their concerns and we turned them into recommendations. So, we were comfortable with our provision in the policy that a match did not amount to probable cause. They felt that it wasn't strong enough, so we made the language even stronger. They were concerned that our officers and our detectives were going to use the technology without being aware of, again, that legacy of algorithmic bias toward a higher rate of accuracy in identifying white men and a lower rate of accuracy in identifying women and people with darker skin tones. So we built that into the policy. We incorporated training for the entire department to make them, to make them aware of that legacy and that tendency in general of this technology to have a certain algorithmic bias. They were also concerned that we would identify somebody through a match and only pursue that lead. And so from that, we developed another provision in the policy that says that all matches return, not just the top match or the match that we decide to take law enforcement action on, but all matches have to be included in the case file. So that becomes, once an arrest is made, that becomes discoverable, and certainly the defendant or through counsel or on their own are free to use any one of those other potential matches as an alibi. We're comfortable that we've arrested the right person because, again, our investigations are based on far more than just a match, but we're not operating in secret. We're telling the public, we're telling the defendant, very, very openly as possible, that yes, we first got your name through a face match, and here's everybody else who came up as a potential match too. Feel free to have at it. So from there, we conducted numerous media interviews. Again, as I told you before, we had those early successes while we were trying to build that policy, trying to build the plane as we flew it. So that did give us the opportunity to highlight successes, and we didn't miss out on the opportunity to make those policy statements during those media interviews. So yes, we arrested this murderer. Yes, we arrested this armed robber, who was identified via face match. And oh, by the way, eyewitnesses identified him through a photo lineup as well. We obviously brought our state attorney's office on board. It's you can't implement technology like this without bringing your prosecutors on board, your elected and appointed city leadership as well. And lastly, we held virtual town hall meetings. At first, we were going to hold 3 throughout the city, and that was in March 2020. And right when we were going to hold those town hall meetings, the entire country, and especially Miami-Dade County, went on lockdown. So there were no in-person meetings. And we said, you know what, we're not going to let that stop us. And so we held virtual meetings instead through Facebook Live. And we found that we reached a far greater audience than we would have in person. We had hoped if we, in each one of these 3 meetings, if we got 50 people, that would be great. We held an English virtual town hall session and a Spanish session. Each one got about 1,300 live views, has since gotten about 3,600 live views. And I really think that, going forward, anything like this that we would implement, even if we did in-person meetings, we would incorporate that virtual aspect as well, and allow people to submit questions, as they did in this case through social media and in person, and really it just gave us that broader reach. By the time that we did this, we had already, like I said, engaged all of the stakeholders that I mentioned before. We really found that our community was very supportive of our use of the technology, and it was really much less recommendations being offered, and just a lot more questions about how we would use their information, and ultimately we felt that they were comfortable with where we were going.
That's outstanding, Chief. Are there provisions in your policy that you're unaware of any other agency doing a similar thing, or at least at the time you created it?
So again, our policy really came out of just as many op-ed pieces that we could find that were critical of the technology. There was a lot in our policy that we really just developed, again, by talking to people and reading things that we wouldn't normally think of as being sources for good policy. Usually, when we're looking for model policy, we go to IACP, we go to PERF, and we go to all these different organizations that already have some type of model policy that's available for us to refer to. And so, we just had to find other sources for our own policy.
That's great. I got to hand it to you on the creative side there, though. You've just encouraged a whole new generation of op-ed writers, I'm sure. Thanks, Chief. Detective Kettner, so we're talking here about, community reaction. I failed to ask you, in your case, for using the genealogy database, did you get any negative reaction? Because I know you got some publicity on that case.
Yes, there were a few folks, but what I ultimately realized is you're never going to have 100% of folks on board with the process. You're going to have those naysayers, and no matter how hard you try, there's going to be some negative to it. And in Montana, there's a lot of concern with privacy rights and that type of thing. So that was a concern that came up with some folks, but most of it was positive.
Yeah, it's good to hear. I think one of the things that that I think we've touched on multiple times in this conversation is this idea of customer success, right? A lot of solution providers today really invest a lot of time and effort in making sure their customers are successful in how they utilize the technology. And some of you have touched on some of that. I'd love to hear you all talk about the importance of customer success, and specifically maybe what's the right way in which your customer success strategies can help ensure that agencies are implementing your technologies in ways that are responsible and are accountable and are transparent and effective. Ganesha, if I could kind of toss it to you first from Mark 43's perspective, what does the best customer success strategy look like?
Yeah, I think that is so important because, we come into generally, I had this experience with vendors. I actually stopped a technology project in Baltimore $1.5 million in and said, get the heck out of here. You're not listening to me. You're not bringing me what I need. And you want to charge me $1 million every time we talk, and it's going to be 1,200 years before I get what I need. And meanwhile, the cops are out on the streets, hampered, and I can't have my commissioner stand in front of the press conference and say, well, it's our technology vendor, right? And so Mark 43, one of the reasons why I came there is one of the first stories I heard about them was that they're in the cars, in the patrol vehicles, and that the cloud technology is nimble enough to be responsive to the needs of the department. And so I think that's the first thing. You've got to listen. And you've got to, again, I love working in police departments, but one of the things we are not good at is communication. Mm-hmm. And it's a paramilitary organization, very much like my father. Do what I say. Don't ask any questions. And with technology, this is something that affects literally from the moment you're in the roll call to the moment you're in your shift. It affects the way you do your job. It affects the way you're judged, by your supervisors and your ability to serve the community. And so always listening from the very beginning about what the agency actually needs. And it's not just talking to patrol. It's not just talking to, IT. The detectives are thinking, differently. Those folks that love their Lotus notes, still, it's got to go. But understand why, right? Understand the importance and what that comfort. We know that saying, what do cops hate, how things are and change, right? So that has to frame everything. So one of the things we've actually created at Mark 43 is a organizational change management function. And so that you don't come in there and just talk about your technology like you're the most important thing in this process. You talk about what are your needs, and also how does the technology match up? And that could change over time. One of the things we've seen, I lived through it in 2015, we've certainly lived through it through George Floyd, is things can change on a dime depending on what your mayor decides, depending on what a protester happened, what your city council does. And so, one of the things we want to make sure to do is ask, what are the pressures that you're having, whether it's coming from City Hall, whether it's coming from your communities, and making sure that as you transition through implementing the technology, that you're actually staying very close to what's happening in the agency, what's happening in that environment. I do things like, make sure I know what's going on in the news. Make sure, like I said, the pressures, that are there. I'll give an example. I had to work through and implement a consent decree in Baltimore City. And we are right now in a city that most likely will be under a consent decree. And what I know about police departments is if you have high violence, if you have issues recruiting and retaining, you're focused on your operational needs. You're not thinking about everything that's going to come when that consent decree happens. And so one of the things we've done on our customer success team is to say, yes, this is what they needed us to implement now, but we know from our research, this is probably what they'll need. We've been in other consent decree cities before. So how do we make sure that we're turning on a dime and making sure that we're building the technology out so that they don't have the pressures from the federal judge, from the monitor, from all these other folks who really are not paying attention to the operational needs, right, per se, but, the things that need to get done as far as compliance. So, I just think it's a constant communication and having the questions that prime the client and the customer to think about things and communicate things to the rank and file that they might not otherwise, because they're really focused on all the other operational needs and the lack of resources that they have to get that stuff done.
Yeah, great point. Director Hearn, from the standpoint of Clearview AI, what does customer success programming look like to you, or strategy look like to you?
Well, a couple of things. I think it's important to remember for the broad audience, right, that we've got Miami represented, we've got Baltimore, but 80,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, 80% of those look like Detective Cadner's agency, right? It's 50 people or less for 80% of those 80,000 agencies. So making sure that your technology works for the 10 as effectively for the people with 10 people as it does with the people with a couple of thousand officers and separate bureaus of analysts and the things that kind of that have and have not, making sure it's equally effective for their needs. Also, communicating regularly with your customers, like Chief Aguilar. Hey, what would you like to see? If you could add one more thing to this, or you could change one thing about it, what would it be? And getting the user input into how the technology is useful versus relying just on your own engineers and your own thoughts on, well, I was a cop once, I know what's good, right? And making sure that you stay contemporary with today's user, not just what you may have been in the past. I think helps with customer success, and then trying to be true as a company to kind of similar to the doctor, right? Cause no harm. Right. When we talk about facial recognition, there's if you're familiar with FISWIG, the Facial Identification Scientific Working Group, they provide great best practice and policy recommendations on systems, on training of examiners, and on the process of doing those things. But it's all geared toward that facial comparison expert and the testimony in court and that aspect. And there's a place for that. There's still a use case and a need for that kind of application of facial recognition. But AI and machine learning has transformed what can be done. And so making sure that while you're true to that part of the science and the technology, you're also advancing the investigative side, where you can use traditional law enforcement investigative process to come to a similar conclusion.
Right. Thank you, Director. And to wrap up our conversation today, I'll go back to our law enforcement colleagues, active law enforcement colleagues, and ask them if they have any closing comments or if they want to remark at all on the customer success piece of it. Chief Aguilar, we'll start with you and then go to Detective Cadner.
So, great point that we heard from Skylar, that, 80% of law enforcement agencies don't look like Miami, don't look like Baltimore. And really, when we're talking about finding model policies, when we're talking about best practices, you really gotta use what works best for you, what works best for the community that you serve. And so while we do have a lot of agencies that reach out to us and ask us, what it is that we're doing in the facial recognition space or in other technological fields, that's really what we want to drive home is that you got to take with you what's going to work best for your agency. Some agencies, for example, may feel that the use of certain technologies like face recognition, that they only want to use it for, say, violent felonies. Some agencies may be comfortable with using it for all types of crime. So you got to strike that balance locally. And also, we heard reaching out to those end users. A lot of times, we're terrible at this just in general at implementation, where management, we feel like we know what's best. We feel like we know what the agency needs, and we forget to talk to those people who are going to actually be on the end user side of the equation, and really fail to bring them into the conversation. So I think that's really key, doing that early on, and I think you really save yourself a lot of time and headache later on down the line. I can't overemphasize the importance of bringing in the public whenever you're going to adopt any technology that has significant privacy implications. Don't think that you're going to be able to do this in secret. People are going to find out. Somebody is going to find out, and once they do, think about what that news story is going to look like. Versus a news story of you talking about the technology open on the front end, bringing people on board and letting them be part of the process, versus trying to walk back anything that you may have already done, to where you've probably sabotaged your own efforts, and something that could have otherwise been a great public safety tool.
And I think it's fair to say that's a legacy that'll live with you for a long, long time as well, understandably. Detective Cadner, closing comments.
Yeah, the panelists have hit the nail on the head with all these points. But yeah, the importance of transparency and getting that out to the public, educating them to these new technologies and the plan for implementing those is really important. And you have to have a plan. Like Anisha said, there's nothing worse than having an idea and just pushing it out without thinking about the pros, the cons, and getting the community members involved and the other stakeholders on board, and the people within your department. Make sure everybody is on board with the new technology coming in. So yeah, I agree with all those points that have been made.
Yeah, some great points today. And Director Hearn, VP Martin, any closing comments from either of you?
Ganesha.
This has just been a wonderful panel, and I'm always delighted to be on with open minds that are thinking about, the issues from around, from each angle. And I think that we would all be in a much better place as it relates to our relationship with communities and where we are in policing if, folks could see this more often. So I just really appreciate the museum and Jim, certainly for all the work that you do for bringing these types of forums together. And we just need to, I think, now figure out how to make sure that more than just law enforcement sees these type of convenings, because I think it will make a huge difference.
Yeah, I would just close with echoing that and saying there's not a technology that law enforcement uses that we don't have guardrails in how and when and to what extent we use it. And facial recognition should be no different. But when we're deciding as policymakers and executives what those guardrails are, let's use facts. Let's use real information and point to real instances of how it's used and the protections you need to avoid the abuse of the use, and not just delve into the possibilities that are endless with anything.
Mm-hmm. Well said. Appreciate all of you for being here today and for your candor and your courage in talking about what it takes to get it right. That's what this conversation was designed to do, and I think you all have done it very well. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for listening to the third and final part of this series about the utilization of technology in law enforcement. A special thanks to those involved in this important discussion covering a wide variety of topics concerning the advancement of law enforcement technologies, how and why they were implemented, what that means for the safety of officers and ultimately their communities, and how involving the community created an opportunity for problem solving. We thank you for your support, and remember, our upcoming episode releases are every Wednesday, and published exclusively on Tuesdays is our monthly Icons episode. We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the Precinct.